Marine Private First Class. James Anderson Jr. was on patrol near Cam Lo, Vietnam on February 28, 1967, when a Viet Cong grenade landed among his squad. Without hesitation, the 20-year-old from Los Angeles threw himself on the grenade, absorbing the blast with his body. He saved his fellow Marines' lives but lost his own. Anderson became the first African-American Marine to receive the Medal of Honor. His heroism embodied the courage of black service members in Vietnam. But his death also symbolized the war's cruel paradox. African-American men were dying in disproportionate numbers, for a nation still denying their families basic civil rights at home. Vietnam was different from World War II and Korea. Black soldiers served in a fully integrated military, where they could rise to leadership positions unimaginable a generation earlier. Yet they fought in a war that divided America, while their communities burned during urban uprisings, and Martin Luther King Jr. called the conflict a betrayal of the poor. They served with distinction while asking why they were dying in rice paddies when their brothers couldn't vote in Mississippi. This is the story of African Americans in Vietnam, a story of uncommon valor amid unprecedented moral complexity, of service and sacrifice in a war that tore both the nation. When American combat troops arrived in Vietnam in 1965, the civil rights movement was reaching its crescendo. The Voting Rights Act passed that August. But progress came amid violence: Bloody Sunday in Selma, bombings, murders, and massive resistance from white supremacists. By 1966-67, urban rebellions erupted in Newark, Detroit, and over 100 other cities. The Black Power movement challenged integration as the ultimate goal, demanding self-determination and pride in black identity. Against this backdrop, young black men were being drafted in disproportionate numbers. In 1965-66, African Americans represented 11% of the U.S. population, but 16% of Army enlisted men, and a staggering 23% of combat deaths in Vietnam. The disparity had multiple causes: higher enlistment from communities with limited economic opportunities, draft deferments more available to white college students, and assignment patterns that put black soldiers in combat units at higher rates. The military was integrated, but America wasn't. Black soldiers trained at southern bases where they couldn't eat in local restaurants or attend movies. They prepared for combat while watching news footage of police attacking civil rights protesters with dogs and fire hoses. They were expected to fight for freedom abroad while their families lacked freedom at home. Muhammad Ali's refusal to be drafted in 1967 crystallized the contradiction. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," he said. "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger." Ali was stripped of his boxing title and faced prison, but his stance resonated with many young black men, questioning why they should fight in Southeast Asia. Martin Luther King Jr.'s opposition to the war, announced in his Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church in April 1967, was even more significant. King called America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, and argued that the war was draining resources from programs to help the poor. His stance cost him allies but reflected growing anti-war sentiment in Black America. Yet hundreds of thousands of African American men served anyway, some believing in the cause, others fulfilling their duty, many simply because they were drafted. Their service was no less honorable because the war was controversial. Whatever the politics in Vietnam's jungles and rice paddies, black soldiers fought with extraordinary courage. They humped through elephant grass, waded through swamps, endured monsoons and scorching heat, and faced an enemy who knew the terrain and fought with determination. In combat units, integration often worked better than anywhere else in American society. Foxholes didn't care about skin color. The soldier pulling guard duty beside you, the Marine covering your advance, the helicopter pilot extracting you under fire, these bonds transcended race. Many black veterans recall Vietnam as the first place they experienced genuine racial equality. However briefly and imperfectly, African American soldiers served in every role and branch. They were infantry grunts, special forces operators, pilots, tankers, artillerymen, and support troops. They led platoons and companies. By 1968, over 1,400 black officers served in Vietnam. The Medal of Honor recipients tell part of the story. 20 African Americans earned the nation's highest decoration in Vietnam. Specialist 6 Lawrence Joel, a medic with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, was wounded twice during a November 1965 battle, but continued treating casualties for 24 hours, saving numerous lives. He became the first living African American to receive the Medal of Honor since the Spanish-American War. Sergeant Rodney Davis threw himself on a grenade to save fellow Marines near Quang Nam in September 1967. He was 25 years old. Private First Class Milton Olive III, just 18, grabbed a live grenade and fell on it to protect 4 soldiers in October 1965. His father accepted the Medal of Honor from President Johnson. Captain Riley Pitts led his company in a fierce battle near Ap Dong in October 1967. Though wounded, he directed his men's fire and personally destroyed enemy positions before being mortally wounded. He became the first black commissioned officer to receive the Medal of Honor. First Lieutenant Rupert Sargent led his platoon against enemy positions near Hao-Ningya in March 1967, assaulting machine gun bunkers and rallying his men despite wounds until he was killed. These men, and thousands of others who died without receiving medals, gave everything. By war's end, over 7,200 African Americans had died in Vietnam. Their names are on the wall in Washington, D.C., representing roughly 12.5% of total American deaths. Vietnam was the first American war where significant numbers of black officers commanded troops in combat. The integrated military of the 1960s produced a generation of black leaders who would transform the armed forces. Colin Powell served 2 tours in Vietnam. As a junior officer in 1962-63, he was wounded by a punji stake. He returned in 1968-69 as a major, serving as a battalion executive officer and division operations officer. Powell earned the Soldier's Medal for rescuing soldiers from a burning helicopter. His Vietnam experience shaped his future military philosophy and his eventual rise to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State. General Frederick E. Davison commanded the 199th Light Infantry Brigade, becoming one of the first African American generals to command a brigade in combat. His leadership during the Tet Offensive and subsequent operations earned him the Distinguished Service Medal. Colonel Charles Calvin Rogers commanded the 1st Battalion, 5th Artillery during a massive enemy attack in November 1968. Despite wounds, Rogers moved through heavy fire directing artillery, personally served howitzers when crews were killed, and refused evacuation for 30 hours. He received the Medal of Honor and later became the Army's 5th black general. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Peterson became the first black Marine Corps aviator, flying over 350 combat missions between Korea and Vietnam. He rose to become the first black Marine Corps general. These officers proved that black Americans could lead in the most demanding circumstances. They mentored younger officers, black and white, and demonstrated that merit, not melanin, should determine advancement. Yet discrimination persisted. Black officers reported being passed over for choice assignments, receiving less mentorship than white peers, and facing skepticism from some white subordinates. Progress was real, but incomplete. As the war dragged on and became increasingly unpopular, racial tensions within the military intensified. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, sparked grief, rage, and confrontations even in Vietnam. Some black soldiers wore black armbands or refused to fight temporarily. Racial incidents increased on bases and even in combat zones. By 1968-69, the Black Power movement influenced many black service members. Black soldiers gave the clenched fist salute, wore Black Power medallions when allowed, and increasingly challenged perceived discrimination. DAP, an elaborate ritualized handshake among black soldiers, became common, sometimes performed pointedly in front of white soldiers. The military was integrated, but it wasn't colorblind. Black soldiers faced disproportionate punishment under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They received non-judicial punishment, Article 15s, more frequently than whites for similar infractions. Courts-martial convicted black defendants at higher rates. These disparities fueled anger and resentment. Confrontations occurred. At Long Binh Jail, the military's main stockade in Vietnam, racial tensions erupted into violence in 1968. Similar incidents occurred on ships, air bases, and rear area installations. While combat units generally maintained cohesion, survival depending on it, rear areas saw increasing racial division. Some white soldiers embraced Confederate symbols, displaying flags and making racist comments, deliberately provoking black soldiers. These actions, tolerated or ignored by some commanders, created hostile environments. The military establishment, often slow to acknowledge problems, gradually recognized the severity of racial tensions. The Defense Department commissioned studies, implemented new policies, and provided racial sensitivity training, with mixed results. Black soldiers felt caught between worlds. In combat, they fought beside white soldiers with genuine brotherhood. But in rear areas, old patterns reasserted themselves. And at home, America remained divided by race despite civil rights legislation. Beyond racial issues, all soldiers faced Vietnam's brutal realities. African American troops endured the same hardships. The mind-numbing boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror, the physical toll of jungle warfare, the psychological strain of guerrilla combat where any villager might be the enemy. They walked point on patrols, knowing the first man usually triggered ambushes or booby traps. They cleared tunnels where Viet Cong fighters hid. They guarded fire bases that came under rocket and mortar attack. They fought in the A Shau Valley, the Ia Drang, Hue City during Tet, and countless unnamed villages and jungle clearings. The environment itself was an enemy. Leeches, malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot afflicted everyone. Monsoons turned trails to mud and made life miserable. Heat and humidity were oppressive. The jungle was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Search and destroy missions meant marching through dangerous territory, hoping to find the enemy. Or hoping not to. Firefights were chaotic, violent, and often ended inconclusively. Body counts became the metric of success, a grim calculus that reduced war to numbers. Casualties came from snipers, ambushes, booby traps, and mines. The enemy rarely stood and fought conventionally, preferring hit-and-run tactics. This kind of warfare was psychologically exhausting. Helicopter pilots, including black aviators like W-01 Louis Willett, who flew Hueys in medical evacuation missions, braved enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers. Dust-off pilots saved countless lives, landing in hot LZs to evacuate casualties. For all the hardship, many black veterans recall moments of genuine camaraderie across racial lines. When bullets flew, race didn't matter. The man next to you was your brother, your protector, your responsibility. Those bonds, forged in combat, often lasted lifetimes. If Vietnam was hell, coming home was sometimes worse. Vietnam veterans returned to a nation that had turned against the war. There were no parades, no celebrations. Many were spat upon, called baby killers, or simply ignored. For black veterans, the homecoming was doubly bitter. They returned to communities devastated by disinvestment, drugs, and violence. The urban uprisings of the late 1960s had left neighborhoods burned out. Economic opportunities remained limited despite civil rights legislation. Many struggled to find jobs. The transition was jarring. In Vietnam, some black soldiers had held positions of authority, led men, made life and death decisions. At home, they faced racism, unemployment, and disrespect. The military had been their one experience of relative equality. Civilian life was a return to second-class citizenship. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, devastated many veterans regardless of race. But black veterans often faced additional barriers to treatment. VA hospitals were sometimes unwelcoming. Mental health services in black communities were scarce. The stigma against seeking psychological help was particularly strong. Some veterans self-medicated with drugs or alcohol. Homelessness rates among Vietnam veterans, especially black veterans, were tragically high. Marriages failed. Men who had survived combat couldn't survive the peace. Yet many black Vietnam veterans became community leaders, activists, and advocates. They joined Vietnam veterans against the war, speaking out against the conflict they'd fought. They organized veteran support groups. They mentored younger men, trying to keep them out of the criminal justice system. Some channeled their military experience into civilian careers, becoming police officers, firefighters, teachers, and businessmen. They used their GI Bill benefits for education, earning degrees despite often attending school while working full-time and supporting families. The Black Panthers and other militant groups recruited some veterans, valuing their military training. While only a small minority joined such organizations, their presence reflected the radicalization many veterans experienced. The Vietnam War left deep scars on America, and particularly on the African American community. The war consumed resources that might have funded anti-poverty programs. It divided the civil rights movement between those supporting the war effort and those opposing it. It sent young black men to die in numbers disproportionate to their population. Yet black service members' contributions to Vietnam were significant and honorable. They served with distinction in a fully integrated military, proving that integration worked even under the most stressful conditions. They achieved leadership positions, earned decorations for valor, and demonstrated courage equal to any who served. The military that emerged from Vietnam was profoundly shaped by Black American service. The all-volunteer force implemented in 1973 led to even greater African American participation and leadership. By the 1990s, the military had become one of America's most successfully integrated institutions, with black officers reaching the highest ranks. Colin Powell's rise to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff symbolized how far the military had come. Powell, who had served in segregated Virginia as a young officer, reached the pinnacle of military leadership. His success reflected opportunities created by the integration struggles of previous generations and expanded by the Vietnam-era military, but recognition came slowly. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in 1982, honored all who died regardless of race. But specific recognition of African Americans' contributions took longer. Only in recent decades have historians properly documented Black Vietnam veterans' service and sacrifice. The war's lessons remain controversial. Some Black veterans feel their service is dismissed because the war itself is viewed negatively. Others proudly recall their service while opposing the war's purposes. Most simply want their sacrifice acknowledged. They answered their nation's call, served honorably, and deserved better than they received. The story of African Americans in Vietnam resists simple narratives. It's not just a story of heroism, though heroism abounded. It's not just a story of racial oppression, though discrimination persisted. It's not just a story of disillusionment, though many became disillusioned. It's a story of men serving in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, fighting a controversial war while their nation underwent a racial reckoning. It's a story of soldiers performing their duty while questioning that duty. It's a story of integration's promise and limitations, of progress and persistent prejudice. The African Americans who served in Vietnam deserve to be remembered in all their complexity. They were not pawns or victims, but agents of their own destinies who made difficult choices in impossible situations. Some believed in the mission, others served out of duty or necessity. Most simply did their jobs and tried to survive. Their service cost them much: lost years, lost innocence, lost comrades, and sometimes lost lives. Their sacrifices unappreciated, their trauma unaddressed, and their communities still struggling for full equality. Yet they persevered. They raised families, built careers, strengthened communities, and passed on lessons learned in Vietnam's jungles to children and grandchildren. They proved, once again, that African Americans would serve their country honorably even when their country failed to fully honor them. The 7,200 black service members who died in Vietnam, the 20 who earned the Medal of Honor, the hundreds of thousands who served and survived, they all deserve our remembrance and respect. Not as symbols or statistics, but as individual human beings who faced unimaginable challenges with courage, dignity, and determination. Their names are on the wall. Their stories are in the history books, though too often overlooked. Their legacy lives in the integrated military of today and in the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. We honor them by telling their stories fully and honestly, by acknowledging both their heroism and the injustices they faced, by learning from their experiences, and by continuing the work they began, building an America worthy of their sacrifice. They served, they sacrificed, they survived. and they deserve to be remembered.